What's up everyone, this is Dr. Tan from Alone Season 9, and today we're talking about Episode 5, and specifically gut infections, because that has been such a huge demand for that topic to be covered, specifically for my season, because a lot of people are getting sick, and for different reasons. So let's get into it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Teimojin Tan. I'm a doctor, former army soldier, and specialize in Arctic warfare and survival. And this year, on Season 9 of Alone, I am the doc that's on. We are currently reviewing Episode 5 and gut issues, along with a little bit of strategies and survival things that I picked up on screen. So if that interests you, consider subscribing. And if you really want to learn that medical stuff, click on www.learnsurvivalmedicine.com. I'm coming out with a new book and you can pre-order it now, which includes a bunch of good things. So check out that website at www.learnsurvivalmedicine.com, and I hope to see you in one of our online classes soon. So without further ado, let's get into Episode 5. We see Benji at around day 20 something taking a beaver and processing that out, smoking it and eating it and really gouging on a lot of the fats, which is amazing for him. It looks so good, the type of stuff that he's able to eat out there. And fun fact, I bet none of you know this unless you know Benji himself. Benji actually got 2 beavers out there. So on screen it was shown 1, but he actually bagged 2 beavers while he was out there. An incredible hunter, incredible feat. And Benji, if you're out there looking at this, or if anyone is questioning Benji as a person, the screen really did an edit that made him seem very arrogant. I know Benji personally, both from the show, and because we're friends after the show, he is not that type of dude. So please cut him some slack and check him out on his social media. He's also doing some recaps as well. In regards to his shelter, he starts transitioning from his A-frame type of shelter to a wiki up. Pretty cool, really simple design. Teepee, which only takes a little bit of paracord on 3 poles, and then you can place different poles as you alternate between those 3, and then the weight itself holds it together. Now he does put his tarp on top of that to give some waterproofing, and then some pine tree boughs on top of that to give it some insulation. Traditionally for Arctic teepees and that type of deal, there's debris ones that are made out of improvised type of deals where you can do it at the base of a tree, and it's a pretty good use of the natural cone and shelter itself. And in deep winter, what happens is there's a little bit of a pocket of where there's no snow. So there's a natural barrier of snow around that, and all you need to do is dig in, add on boughs on top of it and around it, and that's a good improvised shelter. What Benji's doing is similar to some of the setups for winter teepees. And for winter teepees, if you look at how it's done in the Arctic and in those indigenous tribes, a lot of them are done with either thick layers of fur or multi different type of layers. And when we think about our winter warfare training in the army, a lot of our tents are at least 3 layers. But with a big hide, that seems like a pretty good insulation as well. From a waterproofing standpoint, since it's so wet in Labrador, that tarp will do him wonders. Even though our tarp is fairly big, I believe it was a 10 by 12, it doesn't cover that whole distance. So it may be the case where you want to go a little smaller, or change up the design, or incorporate components of natural overhang or natural barriers to make sure your shelter is at least waterproof, because if your gear is wet and you only have one other set, if at all, it becomes a really big burden if everything's damp all the time. Another cool thing that we see from Benji is sharpening his axe with a stone, and that's really cool because for me, the majority of the sharpening that I did was from the file for my Leatherman, which was metal and then diamond file, which was only about yay big. And in addition to that, I had a leather strop that I used. And one thing that you can add to your leather strop is some compound. So a little bit of grittiness. It's a paste that has a little bit of a sticky / grainy texture to it, and it adds a very fine layer for that razor sharp edge. Another really cool video that I highly recommend is Clay Hayes from Season 8. He does a video about sharpening his axe razor sharp with just a stump of wood and then some clay or sand on top of that, and that wet. So you're basically making a whetstone, which I thought was ingenious. So if you're able to do that with a little bit of mud or sand on a piece of wood and use that as a whetstone and get it razor sharp, that's a really cool idea as well, especially for your bigger items like your axe. In regards to sharpening out in the field, one thing that I have to mention is Jordan Jonas from Season 6. I was out visiting Jordan prior to the Season 9 aired, and he showed me the axe that he brought to the Arctic with. And the one big difference in design is that it is one bevel. So typically knives and axes and most blades are double beveled, kind of like that. His was just one side like this, so ground like this and then straight edge like that. Really good for slicing into, cuts super deep, but for sharpening, it's super easy to sharpen. So what happens is you sharpen one side just like that, and all you have to do is brush a little bit on the other side because it's just a straight edge. And what happens is it becomes razor sharp super quick. And instead of having a double bevel like this knife, sometimes when you're taking some off here, you take too much off of here and you actually round it off. So it takes some time and some practice and some accuracy to make sure your blades are always super sharp with that double bevel edge. So if you have a chance, that's one customization that I would recommend to a lot of woodsmen out there that have axes that are multi-purpose. So if you're splitting wood with a single bevel axe, it does take a little bit of technique, because instead of going down straight, at the very last moment, you have to kind of angle it just a little bit. So it's kind of like splitting the wood, and then because of the angle, it's chipping it off just a wee bit. So that's how you split your wood with that. But dang, does it cut deep, those single bevel axes, and it is so much easier to sharpen. Same thing goes for arrowheads. And that one I learned from Benji himself, and he gave me one of his single bevel broadheads that I actually took game with when I was out there. So really cool guy, really love what he did out there. Another thing we see Benji talk about is vitamins soluble in fat. So did you know that there are a few vitamins out there that are only fat soluble? So that is vitamin A, D, E, and K, or ADEC. Those are your fat soluble vitamins. So if you're not having any fat in your diet, or such a minimal amount that you can't digest your vitamins, you can be deficient in those ones. And here's a quiz for you. What vitamin is dangerous in bear liver? Let me know in the comments. In this episode, we also see Benji display some Qigong technique, which is something that I didn't know before. Qigong is a Chinese technique that uses a combination of movement, laughter, and breathing techniques to elicit some kind of emotional and also physiological changes. From a biology standpoint, how does that happen? So just smiling has been researched and known to improve mood. So fake it as you make it does work in this context. In addition to that, those breathing exercises, in addition to very rhythmic and relaxing movement, kind of like Tai Chi, also exhibit some relaxation. And did you know that breathing techniques, especially when you're breathing so that you're either getting rid of a lot of CO2 or increasing your oxygen in your body, can give you a little bit of a high just from breathing. So really cool that Benji practices this and does this in this context when he's not feeling his 100%. We later see him get a grouse, and he cooks a lot of the meat and gizzard inside some beaver fat. And looking at how he's preparing things, he has some meat on a beaver tail and he's throwing things in the fryer. Now, just a little sidebar for grouse gizzard, or just bird gizzards in general. One of the things that I utilize on my property, and the reason why I chose my plot of land, is it was not in a ravine, but really close to a ravine, a plateau in a ravine. And if you guys want me to draw out my shelter location and kind of what was around it, let me know in the comments, because I'm kind of really excited to share that. I just need to practice my drawing skills. But anyways, the gizzard, what it does is it's a muscle basically encased in this really tough type of material. It almost feels like a dog's paw, that thick leathery feeling. And what it does is it uses the grit and that leathery encased muscle to contract and chew whatever the grouse is eating, whether that's spruce or berries. And to cook it, really tough if you just roast it, and really hard to chew if you smoke it. So my recommendation is you boil it. And a lot of the things that I did out there was to boil it for at least 2 hours, not because of killing bacteria or anything like that, but to make it nice and soft. And at the same time, I was crushing long bones to get into that marrow. So kind of made that a routine where I would come home, prepare that meal, and over 2 hours, I'd be whittling something or cleaning up my shelter and having that boiled down, and added a little bit of my secret ration to it to make things taste like a home meal, which was such a motivator and a morale boost. I look forward to my meals every single day. Unfortunately, we see Benji burping, getting a little nauseated, having some abdominal discomfort, and then puking a whole lot. And his immediate reaction to rest and to try to hydrate is perfect. But what happens when you have some bug like this, and I'll talk about what kind of bug I think it is that there's not a whole lot we have out there that's easily digestible. Fats definitely would make something like this worse. Protein's pretty hard to digest and take a lot of energy to digest, not easy on the stomach. And berries, the acidity, depending on what berries you are, if you eat a lot of them, really might make the acidity in your stomach feel worse. So he's down to his salt and water, which may hold him over. But I think we can figure out what happened based on the timeline of things. Since both beavers were not shown on the show, we don't really know when his first encounter was with processing beaver. So the way it's edited, it kind of looks like it was almost an abrupt onset within a few hours. But if it was a few weeks ago where he got that first beaver, which wasn't shown, and there was some contamination with either the meat not being cooked or touching of the guts and then touching of the face, the mouth or whatnot, it only takes as little as 10 cysts from Giardia to make you sick. And Giardia is a protozoa that is pretty commonly associated with beavers, hence beaver fever. Now, some of the things to look out for: nausea, a lot of stomach discomfort, and loud stomach noises. So if you heard your tummy grumble before, it's like 10x that. And in addition to that, lots of nausea, lots of vomiting, and diarrhea as well. One of the key distinctions of the diarrhea is that it's floaty. And what happens is your bowels become intolerant to fats and it just comes out of you in your stool. So floaty stools, really malodorous as well. So poop stinks, but you'll notice that Giardia poops are even worse. So in a span of a week or two, 10 days on average, you should get symptoms if you've ingested or contaminated your meat with Giardia. This can be in your water, this can be on your hands, this can be on that beaver tail plate as well. So that's why I emphasize in situations like this where being sick and dehydrated from that sickness and not being able to hunt or provide for yourself, it's something you really want to avoid. So boiling water, in my opinion, is super important. And you don't have to boil your water for an absurd amount of time unless you're on altitude. When we're talking about over 4,000 meters of height, you just need at sea level to bring that water to a rolling boil, because the majority of what you need to kill dies at 96, 97 degrees Fahrenheit and boiling temperatures at 100 degrees. So boiling your water is important. Handling your food properly, making sure that if you have a gut shot, you wash your hands, wash the meat. But in addition to that, not touching your face, not putting your hands in your mouth. So we don't have soap out there. You can make soap out there with a little bit of wood ash, the white ash, and some fat. So if you're processing down that beaver and your hands are already oily from the fat, just add some lye to that and some water, and that should be a very primitive soap that you can make for yourself. If not, the solution to pollution is dilution, casting us off your fingers and face as much as possible. That might take form as scrubbing with vegetation and getting under the nails. And if you can make little basins for yourself, or it's dirty water with that primary wash and soap and taking off the grit, and then different containers with cleaner water, and at the end kind of dry yourself off. In East Africa, as I talk about in my last video on constipation, all we did was a small little bucket like this, a tiny bar of soap, a little bit of water, and then rinsing it off. And that was able to remove all the bacteria on our hands under our fingernails, enough so that we can eat with our hands. Do I recommend eating with your hands? No. If you can, try to make utensils. One easy thing to make is just chopsticks. It doesn't take any time. You split a wood, shave it off, and then you have some chopsticks. So limiting that contagion and making sure that your sanitation from your pooping and peeing is at least 50 to 100 meters away from your water source, and preferably downstream from where you collect water. Now let's say Benji ate something and got sick within the next few hours, which does seem like the case the way this was edited. What could it be? Something that can get you sick that fast, in my mind, rings for toxins. So bacteria like Staph aureus can make toxins that are not only heat stable, meaning you can't really kill it with heat, but it reacts very quickly within hours and can make you very sick. Wania mentions eating as much as possible, and that's one technique to save as much meat, because when it's out there in temperatures more than 40 degrees Fahrenheit or above freezing temperature in Celsius, what happens is that bacteria can reproduce, and when it reproduces, it produces toxins as well. And ingesting that can cause significant illness. And what do I mean by heat stable things? So for Staph aureus, it's the toxins. But for other bacteria like Clostridium, it's spores. So just to give you an idea, for these spores and these heat stable toxins, oftentimes you need temperatures above boiling temperature, 121 degrees Celsius or 250 Fahrenheit. So out there, the only way that you can possibly do that is maybe jerry-rigging a pressure cooker for your food. Another distinction point for diarrhea is it clear, watery, or is it bloody? So there are different characteristics of diarrhea that can be a little helpful for diagnosis. So we have Giardia with those floaty, foul-smelling, fatty stools. We have rice watery, high volumes with things like cholera. And when we're thinking about Southeast Asia and developing countries with cholera. And then we have bloody diarrhea. And when we think about bloody diarrhea, those are the things that are really, really serious, because that can cause severe blood-borne infections. So it starts in the guts, it rips through the bowels and enters your bloodstream and causes cause things like sepsis, which is an infection that starts at a source and enters your bloodstream. So what I want you to remember is that if you have belly pain, bloody stools / diarrhea, and you have a fever, that is a high risk for these gut infections to transition to very systemic infections, causing your blood pressure to drop, causing you to be very sick and need hospitalization. So it's no joke. Those are the red flags to look out for. And to test your memory, I want you to list out those red flag symptoms in the comment sections at the end of this video. Let's see what you remember. The majority of these illnesses like Giardia and infections from Salmonella, strands of E. coli that causes bloody diarrhea, and Campylobacter that is associated with uncooked meat as well, all require antibiotics. But there are bacteria that you don't necessarily need antibiotics for. One of the things that we see in this episode is Juan Pablo drinking directly from the water, saying that he's built up some resistance. Now, when we're thinking about traveler's diarrhea, that makes sense. There are strands of E. coli that are related to a milder infection, which is watery diarrhea, not the strand that causes bloody diarrhea. So there are people from developing countries who have a better response to that. In fact, one of the preparations to go to countries like that the water might be an issue for traveler's diarrhea is to get a little bit of a vial that prepares your gut for that. It's kind of like a vaccine, but one you take by mouth. So another bug or parasite that people have been asking me to talk about is trichinosis. Since it's mostly seen in domesticated animals like farm animals, pigs, and so forth, it's also seen in rodents and bears. And since that's the biggest thing that we can hunt this year, I wanted to touch base on that as well. So trichinosis is an infection of round worms. So really gross stuff. Can't imagine a bunch of worms just growing inside my belly, but it starts as larvae. You ingest the larvae, and then what happens is it latches onto your gut. First, it goes into the mucosa, the first layer, and then it burrows until it hits muscle. And once it's burrowed that deep, it can infect a lot of different places systemically. So we see myocarditis, infection and inflammation of the heart. We see issues with your central nervous system, your brain, and also your lungs too, causing encephalopathy, infection of the brain, and also pneumonias. And you can only imagine how painful this is, because not only is your gut irritated, it is burrowing into the muscle itself. And fun fact, weird physical finding on someone who gets infected with trichinosis, some people might have periorbital swelling, so swelling around the eyes. So belly pain, severe belly pain, and then weakness and swelling around the eye. Think trichinosis, especially if you haven't been handling or cooking your meat well. And the treatment for this, antiparasitic medication and also steroids. So for a lot of those systemic issues, a lot of inflammation is happening, and the steroid helps reduce that reaction. Again, prevention is key to all of this, so following the hygiene topics that I mentioned, but one secret thing that I wanted to talk about, or at least touch base on, because I'm not sure when I can talk about it, is what you can do to sustain yourself out there if you're having a gut infection. So number one, things that you put in your belly likely will not stay there for long, so you have about 20 minutes from when you ingest something for that to pass through your stomach. So if you're vomiting before those 20 minutes, likely you're only getting partial down to your small gut, which absorbs a lot of the nutrients. And dehydration is the number two thing you have to look out for, because again, if you are dehydrated, your body isn't pumping enough blood to where it needs to go, and you're just going to get more and more sick, and increasing your risk of complications from other things like hyponatremia, low salt levels in your bloodstream, cardiac arrhythmias from that, or neurological issues from that as well. So salt in the right amounts. So I'm not talking about just table salt, not just sodium. There are many different salts out there that you need that would help in situations like this. And not only that, easy to digest energy sources. So I'm talking about glucose, easy to digest amino acids, and you can get that by number one, having sugar on board. That's why when people can't eat anything in the hospital, we give them an IV with a little bit of sugar in it and a little bit of salt. So that's normal saline with a little bit of dextrose or D5 or D10 in their IV. And in addition to that, if you don't have access to fancy electrolytes or anything like that, one of the things that the WHO uses, so that's the World Health Organizations in resource limited situations or countries, is rice water. So rice water has a little bit of digestible amino acids in it, and all you have to do is soak your rice in that rice water, and it happens to leach out some of these amino acids, and it gives you twofold of type of nutrition. You can boil that water if you want to get some of that rice water, but in addition to that, you need tiny amounts of rice. So I'm talking about less than this amount of rice, like a walnut size of rice, in a lot of water to make a porridge too. So you can have the rice water on top and then that porridge there, and that little bit of glucose and starch with with a little bit of digestible amino acids are able to help people with severe dehydration. And this has specifically been studied with kids with dysentery and having cholera. So dysentery being very significant infectious diarrhea. So that may hint to what I have for my last ration, which was a medical ration, not necessarily a food ration. But I'll tell you, after seeing how many people are getting sick on this season, I'm sure glad I brought it. So before we move on to the other people, I want to know, what have you liked about these videos? I've done a few different things, the recaps, the medical videos, the Q&As. What kind of content should I be making for you? Because realistically, I can maybe post once a week. So I really want to optimize the best content for you. Let me know in the comments. So just a quick run through for the other contestants. We see Jessie take a shot at the grouse that was on top of her shelter and getting a broadhead stuck into the shelter. Now for grouse, I really recommend using blunt tips or specific bird field tips because those broadheads go through and through, and sometimes the bird doesn't even know it's hit, and if it's not in a vital area, it can fly off and disappear. And I'm sure there's more than one of us who've hit a grouse and have lost it or temporarily have lost it. So we see Jessie's broadhead stuck really good into that wood of her shelter and just kind of yanking it back and forth. One of the concerns there is snapping the arrow. So if it's a screw top, what I recommend is screwing off your arrow, putting it in a safe place, and then using your multi-tool or knife to dig in the wood next to the arrow on either sides and then breaking it free. Because if you're retching at it back and forth, up and down, not only can you damage your arrowhead, depending on what kind of blade you have, especially for the thin razor ones, you can also damage your arrow. And in addition, cut yourself while you're handling it back and forth like that. So not the best technique, but you can take it off if you dig the sides with your multi-tool. And it's a safer, more effective, and efficient way to do it too. So that's something that I learned from one of my neighbors up in Quebec. Next, we see Adam take an amazing shot right through the eye of a squirrel. Excellent archer out there. And for those of you who don't know, Adam is killing it. Out of everyone out there, I think he's gotten the most kills in Alone history. And I wish more of his success were shown on TV because that guy was killing it. Such an amazing hunter and archer. And this was his first time hunting, just like myself, which is amazing. And it seems like every time I look back at Adam, he is finding a new way to use his tarp. So it actually makes me want to rethink what I would recommend as a 10-item choice because of all the things that he has made so far with his tarp. Shutters, doorways, structures for his chimney, he's made bags out of it, he's made platforms to work clay in. I want to know, what are some creative ways you would use that tarp in, besides making a boat, because that one's obvious. And then we have Tom, who definitely wins for the best stove and most beautiful shelter this season so far. He has built his stove area out of clay and rock, and it just looks like something that you would see in a cabin somewhere. Beautifully done, and it looks like it's leaning up into the mountain, and it's a very long fire, so you can shove in some decent sized logs in there, and that smoke kind of just lifts off out of his shelter. Now, given the light of that area, it looks like there's a little bit of an opening, so there's more that he's working on, but such a nice addition. And with that raised bed, I'm sure it's really nice and comfortable and warm in there. And just looking at the little things you can see around Tom's fireplace, I want you to go back to that episode and see what little details you can pick out, because it is really interesting. And just seeing one thing that made me smile is a little broom for his fireplace, which is so funny, and very much Tom to keep his place tidy and clean. And way to go for that design into the mountain. I think Adam employed a similar technique. I employed a concept of using the lab, but not necessarily a mound like that. And it does bring up so many designs for shelters that I would want to do next time. In this episode, we see Tom walk his trap line, and he gets a rabbit, a big one, with a spring pole snare. So in episode 2, I made a spring pole snare. And one of the things that you want to do specifically for rabbits is having it on game trails. So I imagine he had a trigger mechanism and had his snare on a game trail. And what happens with rabbits, once there's something around its neck, its first instinct is to dart forward. So it strangulates itself with that dash, and when it dashes, the trigger is released and the pole goes out. Clay mentioned in his snare video, which is such a good video, where he goes over multiple different ways to snare that are effective. He mentions what happens in the winter time, or when it freezes, or if you're just using that spring pole over and over again. The bend isn't as aggressive. So there are different lever mechanisms that you can do, whether it's a counterweight or a pulley system. Check out Clay's video because I do think it's really helpful. On his other snares he was demonstrating, I was wondering what his fur catches look like. So typically, if you make a snare with snare wire, primitively, there should be a little bit of a fur catch, kind of like a little wire that catches the fur. So if they go through it, even if it's around the neck, around the body, that little wire catches the fur and it begins that mechanism's tightening up. I didn't really see some on one of the snares that was shown on TV, but that's not to say that it wasn't on any of the other ones, or if he ran out of wire or whatnot, or if he ran out of wire length for that specific snare that he was making. So a little detailed, but I was learning from Donny Dust from season 6, and I do have a primitive survival series with him. So if you're looking on how to make snares and spring pulls and that type of thing, check out that playlist. And in this episode, we see Juan Pablo making a dock, which does beautifully, getting 6 fish off the bat. And what a game changer to be able to fish on deeper waters and to possibly extend that dock further if need be. So really excited for him to get more food in his belly and to get closer to the center of the river to get that water. So what happens is towards the sides of the river, water is a little more slow flowing because of the resistance of the ground and bank, but further on the water is moving more fast. So technically a little less likely to get bacteria and protozoa in there, but again, as little as 10 cysts from Giardia to get infected. So it is a risk. It may pay off to reduce the amount of time that he's boiling water, or it may not. Another thing that's mentioned over and over again in the comment section, if you've been reading some of my videos, is people recommending containers. So either making a clay pot or primitive container, whether that's a burn bowl or a bark bowl, and having stored more water. So you boil once, but have multiple liters or gallons of water stored away. And lastly, we have Karie Lee to finish us off for episode 5. And one thing that I noticed, we do get to see a little bit of her shelter. We see that she's on a ridgeline and she has a lot of dead trees around her. Maybe good for shelter material, maybe good for fire, but I imagine it's going to be pretty darn windy with no natural barriers, and also at the top of a ridge line or a mountain. So we'll see how that goes as the season progresses, but with different types of climates and different types of environments, I'm sure there's different animals that she may be having more access to in that location. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching these videos and watching to the end. Tell me what you remember about the red flag signs about diarrhea and belly issues from this video. Let's see how much you remember, and I'll see you next time. This is Dr. Tan signing out.